Well, welcome everyone. I'm Greg Crawford, and I am delighted to be here again with the EA Zoom community to talk about one of my favorite topics in all of astrology, which is Mercury, which is a very multifaceted, complex, and deep planet to understand, and especially the Mercury retrograde, which we're going to talk about today. As you all know, in popular culture, mainstream culture, it seems at this point that it seems at times that everybody actually knows about Mercury retrograde. It's really widely known, even among people that know almost nothing else about astrology. They've often at least heard about Mercury retrograde. And as you also know, it tends to be vilified and made the scapegoat of a lot of things that go wrong in people's lives. It's very common to hear it talked about as some sort of, like disastrous aberration that just wreaks havoc in people's reality. So what we're going to talk about is how Mercury retrograde, it's not some freak event. It's actually an essential aspect of what Mercury is. Just like night is to day, sunset to sunrise, you can't have Mercury without Mercury retrograde. So the question is, how do we work with it? What kind of opportunities and challenges does it tend to bring into our lives? Because it goes retrograde at least 3 times every one of our calendar years. And it varies how long it actually is retrograde, but it's generally about 3 weeks long, usually 20, 21 days or so, but sometimes it's longer, sometimes a little shorter. My intent here is just to uncover some of the deeper meaning of Mercury retrograde and the role it plays within the totality of the Mercury archetype, and then how can we work with it to be to get more out of it. So right now we're experiencing Mercury retrograde with Saturn in Sagittarius. Right now as I'm talking, which is December 7th of 2017, Mercury retrograde is just barely beginning to move away from Saturn. And since it actually stationed last week in conjunction with Saturn, we've actually been experiencing it the past 2 weeks with Mercury within only 3 degrees of Saturn, which is a really incredibly long time for Mercury to be united with Saturn. And I'm sure a lot of you have experiences to share about that. So towards the end, I'm going to shift into talking about this specific Mercury retrograde and some of its aspects. And then we'll have some time just if anybody wants to share their experiences with it or have any questions that kind of relate to the one we're actually in right now. That would be great for anyone to do that. And initially, I'm just going to go into Mercury retrograde in general and this general meaning. So there is a sort of, Mercury retrograde complex out there, and you'll see a lot of astrologers who actually are really well-known astrologers repeating some of these things, such as, don't buy anything, don't sign any contracts when Mercury is retrograde, which obviously, is not practical advice. You can't generally do that. And there's lots of famous historical examples of really successful things that have come about, contracts signed and whatnot during Mercury retrograde. In my personal life and lives of clients I've worked with and friends, I've seen so many examples of people signing contracts, making significant purchases, whether that be like a home or a car or, renting a new home, that turned out to be really successful, effective things for them. But at the same time, there is something about all of this stuff, including the fact that, people blame Mercury retrograde for anything like a computer or a cell phone breaking down, any kind of travel delay, any kind of vehicle or means of transportation breaking down, missing some sort of important detail, and just miscommunication in general. All of these things do connect with the actual significations of Mercury. And so there is a logic here about why people say all of these things and the fact that Mercury is moving very slow and backwards through the zodiac while it's happening. So what I'm going to start off with is just going a little bit into the meaning of Mercury, relating to some of these significations, and then we'll go more into how that might change when it goes retrograde. So, most of us, when we think about Mercury, as far as, it's a star of Hermes, we associate it with Hermes and Mercury, the mythic figure. And we know he's the winged messenger. And that is one of the major significations of Mercury. It's the closest planet orbiting to the sun. We think about it as sort of transmitting the intelligence of the sun, like the news to all of us. Any kind of form of interpreting meaning, translating meaning, discerning meaning, conveying meaning, all of these things go with Mercury. And not just writing and speech, anything that's even nonverbal, art, anything that you're doing where you're interpreting, translating meaning, and expressing it. It's also connected to travel and technology. And so, I will talk some about evolutionary astrology, and sometimes I feel people will sometimes link it kind of overly with that idea of just kind of classifying, defining things, and being very rational and linear. And especially in terms of talking about Mercury retrograde, that's not really, it's a very complex planet where there's a lot more going on than that. And those types of things sometimes can be a little bit more challenging during Mercury retrograde, but we'll get to that in a moment here. Another thing is commerce and merchants. So as you know, those are all the significations of Mercury. It's always connected to business, the way the economy works, anytime you're negotiating, bartering, any kind of exchange of currency. Hermes is also known as the thief and trickster, kind of a charismatic con artist. So Mercury it's a volatile planet. It's always been seen as an unstable, volatile, things coming in and out of your life. And Hermes in myth, as we know, he delights in, surprising you with some kind of gift as well as taking something away from you. And so again, this is another reason why the whole thing with, don't sign a contract, don't buy anything. That's another reason why people say that connected to Mercury retrograde. Mercury is also always seen as a guardian of thresholds. He's a figure that's always at the crossroads, times of transitions in your life. Mercury retrograde itself is a very liminal space, which means we sort of enter the space of Mercury retrograde on one side of it, and by the time we end up leaving Mercury retrograde on the other side of it, a lot of change tends to happen. Elements of our life will pass away. And as well as thresholds, Mercury as an archetype is always mediating between and unifying oppositions and polarities, which is one of the reasons why it's so important in astrology. So for example, Mercury is the one planet, traditionally in astrology, a lot of the planets got classified. Some might be day planets or night planets or masculine planets or feminine planets or inner planets, outer planets. Mercury is the one planet that is both, and it can go in between. Just like the figure of Hermes can go to the underworld as well as the upper world, the planet itself can be on both sides of those polarities and tends to shift its meaning depending on what other planets it's an aspect to. So for example, it's not just sacred, but also mundane. So it's in the space of Mercury that we can realize, what's sacred about the mundane and what can be mundane about the sacred. What's spiritual about the material world and how can spirituality be materialistic? And also that, the famous link with the unconscious and bringing the unconscious into greater conscious awareness and vice versa. All of these things, Mercury kind of can mediate back and forth and bring together for us. Another aspect of Mercury that gets really important with the retrograde is the idea of Hermes as the psychopomp, or the guide of souls. This figure that when the soul passes on, it helps guide the soul into the afterlife. And it was probably like 4 or so years ago, I believe, that I heard some lectures by Demetra George on this topic, and she was a big influence for me as far as linking Mercury in with the idea of a psychopomp as this archetype that really is connected into our soul and can help guide us in that way. And anyone that's curious about that aspect, I would encourage you to, she has some lectures on her site that are pretty inexpensive. You can order talking about that. But it's in the Mercury retrograde period especially that Mercury can take on that sort of psychopomp role. Another aspect is how Mercury shows up in alchemy. So if you know that the Hermetic arts, alchemy and astrology are two of the Hermetic arts. And some of the aspects of how Mercury shows up in alchemy are, I think, pretty helpful in terms of just understanding what's going on with Mercury, especially during its retrograde. So, you know, the alchemy is, you know, it's the art of both separation and union. And it tends to involve a destabilization that sort of breaks things up, you know, to separate the impure from the pure. Tends to be sort of like a purification process. And that's the type of thing that is often going on with Mercury retrograde. There can be some destabilizing and some volatility going on, but it's a sort of thing that can kind of break up, you know, some really stuck, habitual, entrenched kind of patterns or things going on in your life to make the space for, you know, a reordering, you know, this new form to emerge for you. And the idea that Mercury, you know, is that force that connects the world animating spirit with the body in the material realm, I feel like is just something that's always important to take into account with Mercury. And during its retrograde, which is a kind of an intensification a lot of times with Mercury, we can really feel this a lot more. And that's why we'll talk about it's really important to just be always really paying attention to all the signs popping up around you when it's retrograde. What I have here is just some old, this is like very kind of traditional translations of a couple ones on the bottom with some of those signs are from Artorius, and the ones on the top are, some of that's from Robert Schmidt, and some of that's from Chris Brennan translating some old concepts. So just like in evolutionary astrology, something that's interesting about that with the focus on polarities is that traditional, you know, Hellenistic astrology was all built around polarities. And interestingly, as we think of Mercury as this figure that unites and sort of synthesizes polarities, Mercury has always been seen as, you know, the ruler of astrology itself. And of course, the polarity with Mercury is with Jupiter, since the Mercury signs of Gemini and Virgo are in polarity or opposition to the Jupiter signs of Sagittarius and Pisces. And a couple of the these concepts, you know, where Jupiter might affirm and confirm and stabilize things, Mercury has always been seen as this sort of destabilizing force in contrast to that. You know, the sort of things that can bring up an argument or contest certain things you might believe in. And that aspect of things is really important to keep in mind with the retrograde. So one of the reasons why, you know, retrograde Mercury has that sort of bad rap around a lot of people is there is a tradition in astrology where people do tend to equate any planet moving direct as being better, just in the sense that that's seen as being like the normal way for the planet to move. And so in a lot of ways you kind of associate that with sort of like a mainstream consensus kind of normal perspective on things. Whereas when it's moving backwards, we can kind of think about it bringing up alternative perspectives, counterculture things, going against societal conventions. You know, we can talk about that with all the planets. And that's why I think Jeff Green, you know, with evolutionary astrology, all the retrograde planets are tend to be associated with accelerated individuation. And I think you can apply that just to the general transit of Mercury in a lot of ways too, because it does tend to be one of those periods where, you know, it kind of changes afoot, stuff starts shifting a little bit more out of your control, it seems at times, than normal. And there tends to be a reason for that if you follow kind of where it's guiding you. So what I have here is a graphic of Mercury's synodic cycle. And we got an owl on the side of the evening star and a rooster on the side of the morning star. And what this is supposed to symbolize is that's the sun in the middle. And obviously this is a really inaccurate depiction, but it's just supposed to capture the point that Mercury is orbiting in between Earth and the sun. So this is really the most fundamental thing to, I think, reflect upon just with the Mercury retrograde, is that, of course, it's not actually moving backwards. You know, Mercury moves faster than us. All that's actually happening is Mercury is sort of passing us in orbit from the inside. So when Mercury is retrograde, it's actually at its very closest point to us in orbit that it ever gets. And so it is a period where Mercury's presence is very strong for us. And in fact, you know, Vedic astrology tends to talk about the retrograde planets even being stronger than when planets are direct. The other really major thing with the Mercury retrograde is that it's always this period of it shifting from being an evening star into a morning star. And so, you know, anytime you see a planet in astrology and the Mercury is ahead of the sun by zodiacal degree, that means it's on the evening star side. If it's behind the planet, it's on the morning star side. And our experience of Mercury retrograde always goes from it being observable in the evening at twilight to disappearing, and then eventually towards the end of the retrograde, it reappears at dawn as a morning star, you know, right around the time it starts stationing direct. The other thing you'll see on this graphic is this image is supposed to represent the beams of the sun kind of coming out there. And there's those numbers as far as 15 degrees you see there on either side of Mercury. And then you also can notice there's like a 0 degree thing. So the 0 degrees there stands for the conjunction of Mercury with the sun, which is often called cazimi, or Mercury being in the heart of the sun. When Mercury is retrograde, anytime you see Mercury retrograde near the sun, that means it's in that inferior conjunction part of its cycle. It means Mercury, for that person, they were born with Mercury really you know, in between us and the sun in orbit. Whenever you see Mercury direct, moving towards the sun, that's the superior conjunction side, which is actually Mercury on the far side of the sun for us. And so the other aspect of this is that 15 degree marker. That's sort of an idealized number we use in astrology, that when things are within 15 degrees of the sun, it's called being under the beams of the sun. And it's sometimes you'll see people talk about that being the planet's kind of weakened. If you've ever heard the term combust, that's a more intense aspect. It's more like the planet's within about 8 degrees of the sun. And what's going on there is the planet's coming towards the sun, is kind of being burned up and purified in the rays of the sun. And so there's sort of a transformation at work there. And it's, I mean, you could maybe say the planet's not at full strength, but there's an important, like, symbolic thing going on there with the planet under the beams, and it's kind of being purged or purified, or things are getting kind of broken up. When Mercury then unites at the heart of the sun at the inferior conjunction, it's basically seen as being reborn. And at that point, it's actually seen as being very strong. And then it's moving on from that, and it's kind of not at full strength yet. It's still kind of undergoing that process until it gets out about 15 degrees or so away, and you can see it again. In reality, you know, Mercury can disappear and reappear more like around 12 degrees, but we just tend to use that 15 degree marker in astrology. And so that idea of Mercury being a guardian of, like, thresholds, this is sort of like a threshold stage that we go through when Mercury is retrograde. So we have that idea, it's an evening star, we can see it if we're actually in a location where we could see it. It stations retrograde. It then eventually we can't see it anymore, which is kind of where we are right now with Mercury. We're in that invisible phase. And that's when it's kind of going through its purification phase. Then we have the inferior conjunction where it's in the heart of the sun, it's reborn. You know, it can be a very powerful moment of actually doing mercurial things within the retrograde. And also a good time as far as just internal attunement and setting intentions. And then eventually we see it again as a morning star. And at that point forward, it's moving direct, and we can see it again in the morning. And so those are some very basic little phases we go through with Mercury retrograde. So once we get to the point where we no longer can see Mercury and the sky, that's really the point where we can symbolically associate Mercury with sort of descending into the underworld and going into that sort of guide of souls, psychopomp role. And there's a lot of interesting symbolism to me just with this idea of the sunset. The sunset's always a very liminal time of shifting colors. It's very magical. It's very romantic and poetic. With astrology in general, the sunset we associate, that's basically the descendant or the seventh house, which we associate, with the realm of relationships. And, just like the sky is transformed with all the shifting colors, we're transformed in our relationships. And when Mercury is at this point of stationing and standing still and then descending into the horizon, we're coming into a really strong relationship with Mercury. And so it's really always good just to be prepared for Mercury retrograde, just kind of honoring it and using that opportunity to start going within and kind of noticing what seems to be coming up for you with this transit, basically. So some of the things that we can associate with Mercury retrograde in general, one thing is obviously it's moving much slower than normal. One of the things about Mercury being a volatile planet is that it can move faster than the other planets, and then it has this really dramatic retrograde phase where instead of moving so quickly, all of a sudden it's not moving, it stands still, and then it slowly starts moving backwards. So that's where we get those associations. People like to interpret that as meaning like delays in general. But another thing that really comes out with that, for me at least, is there's a really high level of mental concentration and focus that's also available during Mercury retrograde that you can take advantage of. Sometimes though, people get really frustrated with maybe things not moving as quickly as they kind of like to. So there's sort of a disorienting aspect there you're kind of negotiating. It's also this idea of the mind being more readily able to turn within to the unconscious, the sort of symbolic perception that goes beyond words is often more available, being able to notice signs and synchronicities around you during the Mercury retrograde. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times people born with Mercury retrograde, you might notice, often have a really strong symbolic understanding or ability to communicate through symbols or some more kind of non-ordinary means of communication or expression. And also, actually, people born with Mercury retrograde, a lot of times those people will describe themselves as not feeling disoriented during the Mercury retrograde. And for them, that's actually more of the way that they like to experience Mercury. And maybe Mercury direct can sometimes be a little bit more difficult. As I mentioned before, it's kind of that guide of soul into the world within. This idea of these old patterns and constructs we can really kind of get rid of during this time. It's a really good time to break old habits, get rid of things, open up your life for something new to emerge. However, there is this thing too that can come up during Mercury retrograde where sometimes we start noticing we're being guided towards some old memory or some project we've been working on we're not quite done with, or some aspect of something we've been thinking about or working on just starts kind of coming up for us. And if you notice that dynamic happening with something, it's really important during Mercury retrograde to just make sure you pay attention and you respond to it. It's not a time to just kind of blow that off, because if you do, I think that's where a lot of times people get in trouble with Mercury retrograde and tend to have those more frustrating experiences. Because there is something about oftentimes that will help guide your awareness somehow or other towards, what do you need to actually look again? You need to make this better in some way, or you need to reflect on this more, or whatever the situation is. This is a painting done by a woman I've worked with in the past who's born with Mercury retrograde. And she's actually, besides a painter, she's also a Jungian therapist. And I just kind of like this visual image. There's something about it to me that kind of goes along a little bit about the perception that's available during Mercury retrograde. Just kind of throwing it in there as a visual there. So some of the things just kind of tips in general with this is really just to embrace change. As you notice things kind of changing, some things opening up, things maybe going in a direction differently than you were imagining, really just to embrace that on both external and internal levels, because there is a real flow you can kind of get in with Mercury retrograde. And if you do, you can tend to avoid a lot of the problematic stuff people talk about. Like at the bottom here, this idea, if you're being overly rational or linear, or you're really fixated on some plan, you feel like you really got to control this outcome of this plan and make it happen. And that's where you can really go wrong, because if you're trying to force something that's just not there, it's better to really be listening to your intuition, looking at the synchronicity of things going on around you. And that idea of signing contracts or initiating businesses or initiating new plans, that can actually go very well during Mercury retrograde. But I think it's really good, more than normal, to pay attention to your gut instinct and what kind of signs you're seeing associated with it. So for example, if there is something you're just really excited about, then all of a sudden you're in Mercury retrograde and it seems like it's not just, something's off about it, that would maybe be a good thing to kind of take a step back and reconsider and just make sure, is this really something that you want to go through with? Do you need to rethink this in any way? When everything just seems to be going for something and it's all the signs are pointing in that direction, it seems real exciting to you, I mean, there's no reason not to do something just because it's Mercury retrograde. Sometimes people do find, when you start something during Mercury retrograde, just like people born with a Mercury retrograde, there might be more of a resonance of Mercury retrograde about that thing that you'll just kind of notice going forward. And when Mercury goes retrograde again, something might happen in more development. Great time, like I said before, internal processing and attuning. And there really is a strong mental focus available. So I find it to be a really great time if you have some kind of research project you want to do or some kind of creative project. If you can just really zero in and focus on that, there's really strong energy available for it. I think when you're trying to get multitask and do a bunch of different things at once, the Mercury retrograde energy can be a little bit more challenging. But if you can just focus in on what you're doing, there's really a lot of power there with it. I think I have time. I was debating if I have time for this or not, but I think I can briefly go through this slide. So there's a little bit of text here from the Homeric hymn to Hermes. A lot of you are probably already familiar with the birth of Hermes, but as far as the myth goes, I think there's some just interesting things about that, which are kind of some interesting sort of advice or lessons you can learn with the Mercury retrograde. So you may know, Hermes fittingly was born in a cave out of this very secretive affair between Zeus and Maya, who is one of the Palladian sisters. And he's an extremely precocious baby. He's like born, he's up right away, talking, heads out of the cave right away into the wilderness, and kind of has something in mind he's going to do, but then he notices a turtle, and his mind just leaps into this vision of how he could turn this turtle into a musical instrument. So he actually, kills the turtle, hollows out the shell, puts strings on it, and he basically invents the lyre, or like a stringed instrument. He plays some music, and then he gets this idea. I think this would be a great idea to steal the cattle of Apollo, which is pretty insane thing to want to do, given that who Apollo is. You can't really get to be a more powerful person than the sun and Apollo. But he does it anyway, and he steals the cows. He marches them backwards, which basically covers up their tracks. And there's an interesting thing with that, as far as concealing the cows and stealing them and marching them backwards. And he's successfully able to steal them. That one of the things I didn't mention earlier with when planets are under the beams, traditionally in astrology, one thing that's seen as being really effective when planets are invisible is actually doing things that are invisible or doing things that are hidden or somewhat secretive, and those things can be more effective actually during those periods of time. And then of course Apollo's enraged. He wants retribution. He wants Zeus to punish Hermes. So he's being Apollo. He obviously figures out he took the cows, but when they go to confront Hermes, Hermes right away is like, playing it off, being, oh, how could I have, stolen these cows? I'm just a little baby. You're Apollo. How could I do this? And Zeus, just starts laughing because he's just very enchanted by how precocious this kid is, and he obviously kind of recognizes right there about Mercury's abilities. And Hermes also recognizes that Apollo's really mad. And so he ends up entertaining them by he pulls out the turtle shell instrument he just invented. He sings this kind of raucous song. And Apollo, sees this instrument and he is just spellbound. And Hermes then gifts it to Apollo. And so I think there's an interesting thing there where Apollo's sort of having one of those frustrating Mercury retrograde experiences of people we kind of talk about in popular culture. He's really mad. He's stressed out. He feels embarrassed. This little baby just showed him up and embarrassed him. But all of a sudden, out of this experience, he gets this this gift of this stringed instrument, which, if you know about Apollo, that goes on to be a very important thing. He's a god of the most exquisite, detailed, beautifully aesthetic, harmonious musical compositions. And so I think there's just something there with that story where there's a few different elements of it. I think the idea, if something with Mercury retrograde, if you are having those experiences that are a little bit more frustrating, to just really pay attention. There might be something kind of losing, but there's something probably coming in at the same time, and being able to focus your mind and being able to shift and move with that, and kind of move in the direction that you're kind of being guided into. And because there's often, these sort of callings of souls we talk about in evolutionary astrology, with like our soul desires coming out. There can be very powerful things like that that come out during the Mercury retrograde transitions we go through. So with the rest of the time we got here, I want to go into a little bit the actual current Mercury retrograde that we're in right now. So, and then if people have any comments here in a moment, I'd like to open it up if people would like to share any of their experiences, and we can talk about that a little bit as I kind of go through some of this information. So one of the really important things just to recognize always with Mercury retrograde is just to notice, what degrees are we working with? So in this retrograde, Mercury went up to about 29 degrees of Sagittarius, and it's going to go all the way back to 13 degrees of Sagittarius. Every single time we go through a retrograde, we're going to get Mercury moving back and forth, whatever zodiacal range that is, 3 times. The first time it's going through it, it's not actually retrograde. A lot of times people call that sort of like the shadow zone. And see at the bottom, we went into that around November 14th. That's when November 14th is around the time that Mercury hit that 13-degree mark. So ever since November 14th, we've been in this range of zodiacal degrees that Mercury's going to eventually come back to. However, it's not this thing that's really just going back and forth like this. That first section we experienced with Mercury was Mercury very bright and moving direct as an evening star. And there's some astrologers, if y'all are familiar at all with Gary Keaton, he's done some really interesting things with the loops of Mercury, which I'm not going into here, but is definitely worth checking out, which kind of shows you like these sort of loops on the ecliptic that Mercury goes through. And because it's going back and forth this degree range so many times, this is obviously an area of your life which is going to be really highlighted. So it's always really important to focus in on what house is that happening in your chart. And just at the most basic level, making sure you understand that, what areas of my life with this house are probably going to be coming up. And then, of course, the next step is to look at all the aspects that are going to be made with that. So you might have planets between 29 and 13 degrees of Sagittarius, or maybe you have any mutable sign, Virgo, Gemini, or Pisces between 13 degrees and 29 degrees of Sagittarius. Or maybe you have another fire sign, so you're getting a trine in that degree range, whatever it is. The actual specific time that Mercury is actually just moving retrograde is from the 2nd of December until the 22nd, which is really fascinating because it means Mercury is going to be stationing at the solstice, which we can talk about here in a little bit. And then next week on December 12th is when we're going to get Mercury in the heart of the sun, that moment when Mercury is reborn. And that's happening at 22 degrees of Sagittarius. So that time period on the 12th is actually a really good day if you have some Mercury business you want to do and you kind of want some extra sort of pop on it, or I've actually for a while now been focusing on times that Mercury is within a degree of the sun, and it's very consistent. I find that it's a very powerful time for anything mercurial that you want to do. The most fundamental thing to recognize about this Mercury retrograde, besides the fact that it's in Sagittarius, which we'll talk about here, is this really unique situation we have with Saturn. As I mentioned, between November 23rd, basically, and December 9th, that 2-week period, Mercury is within 3 degrees of Saturn. And we're just on a threshold right now of getting out of that 3-degree range. So that's a really long time for Mercury to be united with Saturn. And this is even more significant because at the time that Mercury ultimately is stationing direct, right as Mercury starts to station, we're going to get Saturn entering Capricorn, its own sign, right at the same time of the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, which would be the summer solstice in the southern hemisphere, or Capricorn solstice. I often just use that term for it. So it's this really interesting thing, which is going to then basically be Saturn in the heart of the sun, right at the solstice, as Mercury is emerging again as a morning star at the same time, and also standing still at the solstice. And so the actual 3 times that Mercury is actually going to line up hitting Saturn, we already experienced. So November 27th was the first time at 27 degrees. Yesterday was the second time. So I know people are probably still really feeling this right now. And yesterday that was at about 28 degrees. They're still really close right now. And then later on, January 12th, we're going to get Mercury coming back and hitting Saturn again at about close to 3 degrees of Capricorn. So at that point, I think there's going to be a lot more clarification probably in the bigger picture about what all of this means. And that January 12th period is probably also going to be really interesting just in terms of the meaning Saturn Capricorn is going to be bringing into your life. You should be getting a lot more understanding about that. Some of the big things that I just think about in terms of Mercury being united with Saturn. One is it's interesting in terms of Mercury being in the sign of Sagittarius, which is the opposite sign that of its home. So Mercury's home is Gemini. Sagittarius is the opposite polarity sign. And that aspect traditionally in astrology has always been, the opposition has always been linked with Saturn. There's a meaning there of Saturn itself that we kind of find in the opposition. And it's also often been known at, sometimes some of the old translations has been translated actually not as detriment, which you'll sometimes hear, but adversity is one of the ones that people think is a pretty decent translation of it. And so there's definitely adversity I think that we have to endure and face and deal with right now, with Mercury being united with Saturn, which also sort of goes with the forces of sort of necessity. Those kind of aspects of life, or our, if you want to call it fate or destiny, however you want to talk about it, there's, you know, aspects of our life that are really actually out of our control. There's a level of things that we do have control of and we can co-create. But Saturn definitely can put us in place of those things that are hard to deal with. And you know, there can often be suffering involved with that, or some difficult feelings. But there's also, you know, a lot of compassion that can come out at the same time with that. And so there's a certain level of a little bit of surrendering to that needs to be done, I think, with this transit too. However, another really important thing to keep in mind is as we get close, we're also dealing with the very final days and weeks of Saturn in Sagittarius before it goes into Capricorn. And if you're familiar with some of the old festivals, there's this old thing called the Saturnalia that would always happen around the time of the Capricorn solstice and the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, where there was this sort of like loosening of the bonds, and it was a kind of a more chaotic festive period where you know, servants and masters might change places. And there's this sort of interesting thing there with Saturn, where, you know, to be healthy with Saturn, it really kind of needs things to be broken up and destabilized, so you can kind of reorder things and restructure things in a way that's going to work for you better. So there's an interesting thing, I think, also going on right here with Mercury and its volatility, kind of breaking things up, these Saturn things in our life, facing whatever kind of big lessons we have been here to learn with Saturn and Sagittarius, and then sort of, you know, taking us over the threshold of entering Capricorn. So I don't know if anybody wants to jump in right now and share any of their experiences with Saturn. I could take, you know, a comment or two or three or whatever or whatnot, and then there's some. If not, we can move on, because there's some more things I can talk about too. But if anybody wants to share anything just about the ideas they have about Mercury and Saturn, I think that would be interesting to hear from people.
I will, Gray.
Okay.
So, where to start? Okay, so my natally Mercury's retrograde,
Okay.
In Libra, and conjunct the South Node at the end of Virgo. My Saturn is also in Virgo and has, by progression, moved past the South Node. So they're all at the end of Virgo. Also, my progressed Mars has moved into Capricorn. At the Saturn turned direct exactly square my Saturn.
Okay.
At 21 degrees Sag and Virgo. So and meanwhile, and also Saturn is where it is now is square my nodes. So I feel like I'm at this crossroads of moving into my Mercury and moving into my Saturn, or moving out of my Saturn, or it's like the realization just hit me that all of this is happening all at once, and it's like this transition of Mercury and Saturn as I get older.
Yeah. Well, also if your Saturn's there in Virgo, that means the inferior conjunction, or the Mercury cazimi, or Mercury in the heart of the sun, it's about going to happen at about 22 degrees of Sagittarius. That's going to be squaring your Saturn.
Yes.
So that'll be, yeah, that's very significant Do you notice anything in your life? Is there an example of anything you don't have to, any example you'd want to share that would kind of illustrate something about that?
Well, Saturn's transiting my 6th house, and I've had, my whole life I've had some health issues, and it feels like it's maybe I'm learning to cope with it, and you know, kind of move on despite, you know, what's going on. I mean, the chronic fatigue was was what was going on. So it's it feels like it's not, I wouldn't say that it's gone away, but I've learned, I think I've learned how to deal with it.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that seems like that would go well with it. Sort of just like accepting it in a certain way and kind of learning how to work with it a little bit more effectively.
Yeah.
Cool. Is there anything else, or I don't know if anybody else has something? If there's somebody else that wants to share something.
I do.
Okay.
I have my south node, same place as Sue, I think, at 26 Sagittarius, and so Mercury retrograde on my south node, and I have reapplied, or I have applied into an area that I used to work in. Really looking forward to further response there. Had phone interview and contact and back and forth. So looking forward to a face-to-face interview through this period here. Pretty excited about it.
Cool. So you're saying the south node is 26 Sag? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
And then Mercury went retrograde at that second in my area, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The ascendant is on my sun at that point. So it really feels like things are just, there's a whole bunch of touching my chart through this retrograde chart, but it just seems huge.
Yeah, that's cool. I wonder if that'll be cool. I wonder if around the next week when we hit that inferior conjunction with the sun, which would be kind of near south node, that'll be interesting if something comes out.
Right, on the 12th, right?
Yeah, with that thing you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah,
cool.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, cool. Those are some good positive examples. Does anybody else have anything they'd want to share? If not, I can go on to the next slide.
I had something real quick. I actually have, not in this sign, but I actually have this aspect, Mercury retrograde conjunct Saturn in Pisces.
Oh, okay.
So this conjunction here is actually squaring that particular natal placement, and there's been it's taking place in my 4th house, and there's been some issues with family, some discoveries that I've made on my own. Haven't gotten confirmation of those yet, but yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to share real quick.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that, yeah, so again, that's a perfect example of something where you're right in the middle of it, and there's definitely something changing that you don't totally understand fully yet, but yeah, through the course of this, I'm sure that gets clarified for you. That's a good example.
Exactly.
Is there anybody else that'd like to share something?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know about Mercury retrograde by progression.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a whole nother topic, but I'm actually really into that. In fact, I'm actually going to be talking at the UAC United Astrology Conference next year. That's actually my lecture is going to be about Mercury progressed. You could always write to me about it. I guess I'll have my email at the end, but yeah, really quickly, that's just like it's kind of a big topic, but yeah, that's a big shift people go through, but that's kind of more of a lifetime kind of shift because, like if you, for example, have Mercury stationing in your by progression, we're talking like years where it's not moving. And let's say you're born in a time period where Mercury retrograde is retrograde for it's like 21 days or something. That means you're going to have Mercury retrograde like 21 years. And yeah, that tends to be a big kind of change and shift for people. One really quick thing I often notice with people with that is it's that sort of guide of soul thing, and often something kind of coming out that, like in evolutionary astrology, the way we talk about maybe something with like fruition or some kind of gift of soul you kind of carry with you. I often see that with people that they kind of start connecting to something like that during that period. But yeah, it's different because you're talking about a long kind of arc of time. But that can be very disorienting for people because you could be somebody that's born with Mercury direct, and then you go through this really long period of Mercury retrograde by progression. So yeah, do you have a more specific question about that, or?
Well, Mercury will retrograde by progression on my south node.
Okay.
So,
yeah, well, I think that would definitely be something I would be looking at, probably kind of tapping into one of those. Like if you're into evolutionary astrology, for example, and you think about that as being sort of something connected strongly with gifts you carry from the past or old patterns. Yeah, that would be something you definitely could interpret that way. I would say with that. I mean, whatever ends up happening. Are there any other questions or comments about anything?
I have a comment, Marie.
yes,
that your progressed birthday is my birthday.
that's right. It is.
When it turns retrograde, because I was born when it was stationary.
That's right. That's right. Right now it is stationary, but it's still direct. But yeah, I think I have 2 years to go before it's directly retrograde.
Wow.
Cool. Yeah, that's a topic I'm really into, though. So if you want to end up asking me questions later, I'd be happy to go into it more. Any other ones, or we can kind of move on here? I think we got another 5 minutes or so.
So, Gray, since this is the last meeting of the day, it's open-ended, so you can go longer if you wish.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just mention quickly that my progressed Jupiter is at 26 degrees Sag on the galactic center, and it's retrograde. So that's progressed Jupiter retrograde.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have anything? Have you noticed anything you're starting to notice with that? That seems very significant with the Mercury and Saturn right there.
Heaps, but it's too personal.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Cool. Yeah.
I have a question. If somebody's Mercury progress like later in life, how does that affect the querent? How does that affect them?
Like, what do you mean?
If you were born with it direct, and like much later in life it goes retrograde, is it where they're able to learn how to communicate better, or does it more difficult for them?
Well, I mean, it's not an isolated thing, so there'd be so many other things you'd have to look at about how it's impacting somebody. But no, I do not, as a general rule, I would not say that means things are gonna go badly. They're gonna have issues with communication at all. I do think there's sort of something. It's definitely a shift that people go through, and it's a more dramatic shift than just the normal, Mercury changing signs by progression. And yeah, it really depends on a lot of other things. What other things are going on with their chart at that time. But there is something I've really noticed. The one thing I did share, I just shared because I've noticed it actually so many different times, that idea of, that idea is sort of with those of you in the EA and, you know, Jeff Green's work, and the idea of like the individuation and getting pulled within. I do see that a lot of times with, so let's say, I mean, for example, people, maybe somebody, astrology could be an example, actually. I've seen people get into astrology who seem to have a sort of preternatural ability with it when Mercury goes retrograde by progression at different ages, like somebody who does it at like a 19 or versus somebody else who's happening like later in life. And that seems to be something, for example, that, you know, it's just really kind of ends up calling to them, that they end up really wanting to work on and develop more. But it could be all kinds of things. I think it is, I think about sort of too a little bit like almost like the cinematography of your life. Like if your life's like a movie, you could almost like think about like the cinematography kind of changing and shifting a little bit. You know, it's kind of a subtle influence but it's definitely really significant, the way the progressions work.
So like, are you saying it's like almost like a review of how they think and communicate? Because obviously they'll probably be retrograde the rest of their lives. Yeah,
I mean, not necessarily a review. It's more like a change. I mean, just the way I think the perception kind of, there's something that there's a shift and there's a change. But yeah, certainly if it's happening for somebody towards the end of their life, that definitely could be part of like some kind of if it's happening for you in the latter part of your life, that would make a lot of sense that it would actually, part of that would probably be a review of your life. Yeah, that would make sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just going to go on to the next slide because we can keep talking if other people have other things they want to share. This is just some of the really major, pulling out some of the really big aspects going on with this. So, you know, fundamentally, we talked about before, there's just the meaning of Mercury itself in Sagittarius to think about. And again, like I said before, that it is a unique situation where we, in terms of, you know, Mercury's rulership, there's an interesting thing there about it being in its opposite sign. You know, Gemini is Mercury's home sign. Sagittarius is the opposite sign. And so what that means is we have to really look at Jupiter because Mercury's not in its own home, and it's in Jupiter's home. And so there's an interesting thing right now where we got Jupiter in Scorpio. And right when Mercury stationed retrograde at pretty much the exact same time, we also experienced the very first exact trine between Jupiter and Scorpio and Neptune and Pisces. And this is like kind of a big transit we're going to have this whole next year. Jupiter and Scorpio, Neptune and Pisces stay in trine till something like next August. I forget the exact date right now. And there's sort of an additional influence of Neptune on this because at the beginning we had that Gemini full moon that was squaring Neptune right at the beginning. You know, as Mercury's stationing, Mercury was ruling that Gemini full moon, and it was in square to Neptune. And on the other side of this transit, Mercury's going to station direct at like 13 Sag, and Neptune's going to be at like 11 or 12 Sag. So, you know, Mercury doesn't get all the way back to like an exact square with Neptune, but it does get very close to Neptune again. And so there's a really big Neptune Sagittarius interplay we have going on here. And I know since a lot of y'all into evolutionary astrology, a real fundamental thing about that with Jeff Green's work is that idea of, you know, your belief system perhaps being challenged by your actual experience of your life and reality, and that kind of like knowledge and wisdom you gain from your actual experience in life, and how that might start changing and making you question, or some shifts going on in your belief systems and that sort of thing. Another thing going on is we have Venus co-present with Mercury this entire retrograde. So Venus is in the same sign as Mercury the entire time. One thing that I've really learned a lot from going back to older forms of astrology is in the kind of foundational astrology texts, that idea of just a planet being in the same sign of another planet, even if they're not actually at the same degree, is actually always seen as being really significant. And the more I've paid attention to that, it is something I definitely see. After Mercury goes through its conjunction with the sun, though, it's then going to also conjoin Venus. If I'm remembering right, I feel like it might be around December 16th, but I might be wrong. It's a few days after the Mercury Cazimi next week. But there's also something about that. And just like we talked about when I showed you that graphic of the synodic cycle of Mercury, Venus, very interestingly, is also invisible right now. But Venus is on the other side of the sun from us. So while Mercury is going into its like inferior conjunction with the sun right now, Venus is also invisible and under the beams of the sun and going through that purification process. But Venus is on the other side of the sun from us, going into the sun, which will happen later in Capricorn in January. And so that's another really fascinating thing about this retrograde. And then there's also the trine with Uranus. That's going to happen 3 times. It already happened November 25th. It's going to happen again a few days, December 10th, and then again in January. And one of those things that really harkens back to the whole Saturn trine with Uranus that's really dominated this past year. And even the previous Mercury retrograde is an interesting thing. If you all remember the one back in May, maybe April and May of this previous year, it started in Taurus, but then the retrograde moved back into Aries, and Mercury ended up stationing direct with Uranus for a really long time. It was kind of this time we have Mercury with Saturn staying together a really long time, and that previous one we had Mercury staying with Uranus for a couple weeks. And so there's something about this one that even kind of ties back to that one a little bit. And it's definitely, there's something also about this where whatever's been going on for you with this Uranus trining Saturn, just like we're at the end of the Saturn's time in Sagittarius, there's definitely something here. There's some kind of final lesson, some kind of final thing to look over or do again, or get some kind of new insight regarding whatever in your life has been correlating with that. And then again, like I already kind of talked about, there's that idea that Mercury ends up stationing actually at the solstice. As you probably know, the solstice itself is all about, the actual meaning of it is like the sun standing still, and Mercury's going to be standing still at the same time. For us in the northern hemisphere at the winter solstice, we talk about that as like the peak time of darkness, where the kind of light is like reborn, and we start welcoming the sun again. And we're going to be basically welcoming the light of Mercury at the same time. Mercury's going to appear at dawn, and in that kind of liminal time period again as a morning star at the same time. And again, that's also going to be happening at the exact same time that we get Saturn going into Capricorn. So I don't know. Yeah, I know we're over right now in time, but if anybody, can hold the space if anybody has any comments about any of this they'd like to share. We can go a little bit longer and share something if anybody would like to.
Okay, hi, thank you. I just noticed, this is really interesting because I have in my progress chart, my sun is in the last degrees of Sag, and I have also I have Mars and, wait a second, let me just get my progressions again. And I also have Mars and Mercury in Sag. So it's like I have a feeling that it's all going to be sitting right on my sun. And it's like the last degree of my progressed sun in Sag. And then everything's going into Capricorn, and I'm going to be having a Saturn return in Capricorn and a Jupiter return in Sag.
Wow. Yeah.
Can you speak to me on that? What could it mean?
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably too much to. Yeah, I don't know, but I could go into that right now, not seeing like the rest of their chart and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you can if you want to send me email or something after this.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it just seems like a lot of Sag lessons or something.
Yeah, I mean, so it's going to be a Jupiter return in Sagittarius. Is that what you said later?
Yeah, at the same time, and then I'm going to get a Saturn return, second return in Capricorn.
Okay, yeah. So that what degree is your Saturn?
2.
Okay, yeah.
Or 3. I have to let me check exact. Hang on. I should know this by now, but it's 2 or 3, and so is my my Saturn is that's my progressed. Give me a second.
Is your natal Saturn in Capricorn, or do you mean your progressed?
Yes, they're both. My progressed is at 8, and my natal is at 2, and my Jupiter's at 3 Sag.
Well, the one thing I would say about that is, yeah, I guess I can't answer part of that. Would be just, yeah, having the second Saturn return at the same time. All of this is going on leading up to it, and then I think it's around, if I'm remembering right, like January 12th or so. When Mercury hits Saturn again, it sounds like it's going to be really close at the same degree possibly of your actual Saturn. So you'll have Mercury and Saturn right there. And just in terms of the second Saturn return, often can be seen as a time where you can, I guess, just reach like I mean, I haven't experienced it yet. I'm not there personally yet, but what I've always heard about that is, it's seen as a time of even, greater maturity, kind of really, some of these old patterns you might have been stuck in, being able to finally kind of start throwing them off or resolve big resolution of things, these big overarching storylines of your life. So I would imagine there's something like that going on with it. And whatever's kind of going on right now in the weeks leading up to it with this Mercury retrograde, there's just going to be some really important changes or things you're noticing that you're going to be getting a lot of really important information with regards to that. That's going to kind of start giving you a sense of what that's going to be, is what I would be guessing.
Yeah, thank you. Sounds kind of serious to me.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I have to look into that more. Maybe I'll even send you a little something on that. But yeah, I think I really investigate that a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments or anything? I do have a couple more slides. I wasn't sure if I even get to these or not. I can do them really quick. And this is actually in reference to a book that was just released. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar or not with this book by Gary Keane that was just released literally a couple of weeks ago. And I haven't had time to read the entire book yet. I just got mine in the mail though, in the time leading, I think it was the week, the Wednesday before Mercury went retrograde. I actually got my copy in the mail. And this is going to be it's a significant book because nobody, to my knowledge, has really ever written attempted to really go into Mercury on the kind of deeper level that Gary Keane is in this book. And one of the concepts he brings up in this, which is really important, is this idea of, I didn't want to get too technical earlier, but in that time period when Mercury is about to station retrograde and it's an evening star, we have something called the maximum elongation of the evening star, and that's right when it's kind of its brightest, or you can just kind of see it the best. And that happened around November 24th. And that maximum elongation of the evening star actually every single time happens roughly in the same degrees as the inferior conjunction, as well as the later maximum elongation as a morning star when it's moving direct again. And his book actually has this whole ephemeris in the back where it catalogs all this for you. So this time, and some of you have already been interestingly, the people are making comments so far all seem to have, for the most part, planets right here, which kind of makes sense. So this time it's at Sagittarius 25 degrees was the elongation. The rebirth of Mercury is at 22 degrees on the 12th. And then right on the first day of the new year, actually that's a typo. It should be January 1st, 2018. That's going to be at 20 degrees of Sagittarius. And I don't have time to go into this really right now, but there's a fixed star, Russell Hogg, or I don't actually know how to pronounce it, and Ophiuchus, which also might be a mispronunciation. But that's the serpent holder. And Rasselhag is sort of up at the head of the serpent holder. And there's tons of interesting information on that that you can think about. On my blog, if you go there, I wrote a little article on this, and there's like a kind of little brief information on it. But that's just something to also keep in mind. You can always kind of look at, there's something very significant about this concept that these three things line up like this. And so this degree range is going to be highlighted, especially that second decan of Sagittarius, basically. And the other thing that's in his book that's really interesting is this elemental year that happens, that we get these Mercury retrograde periods and elements of signs. And so this one we're getting right now starts a year where they're all going to be happening in fire signs. And so this one is in Sagittarius. We're going to later in 2018, we'll get one in Aries, and then Leo. And then we're going to get a third one that's all in Sagittarius again. Although that one actually might go back slightly into Capricorn, but primarily in Sagittarius. So one thing you can just think about too is this idea of, what are the houses, what are the fire sign houses in your chart? So wherever you got those fire signs, just to be thinking about that, because, not only this Mercury retrograde, but every single one next year is going to be happening in one of those fire signs. And that might start kind of cluing you in a little bit about, what are some of the things that might be coming on the way. And this is actually a quote down here I just kind of pulled out of his book, which I thought was pretty good. And my screen is actually slightly blocked reading it, but it's basically saying something to the effect of finding new sources of creative fuel and inspiration, learning to use this fire, to burn off the old, purge falsity, coming more into touch with our uniqueness, seeing and creating our future. And there is that connection of fire to spirit, so there's also an aspect of this eliminating some higher spiritual understanding. So that is basically it for what I got. If any of y'all have questions, you're free to email me at consultation@graycrawford.net, and graycrawford.net is my site. I do have an article on Mercury retrograde on there, the current one, kind of going into it a little bit. Are there any other final questions or comments or anything people have?
Gray, could you just stop share for us, please?
Oh, yeah.
Top
I can
of
do
the
that.
screen. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great.
I thought it was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
A lot of insight, a lot of things I didn't think about before.
Cool, thank you.
Awesome as always. Thank you, Gray.
Yeah,
thank
it's
you.
really good.
Cool, thank you.
Yes, it was great. Thank you.
Okay, looks like there aren't any questions. So, Gray, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And see you next time. Would you all please thank Gray Crawford?
Thank you.
Thank you, Gray.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
See you at UAC.
Yeah.